It's not a long time ago that the Leica M10 Monochrom hit the market, and you find a lot of videos on that black and white camera on my channel, which you can explore and see all I have to say about image quality, handling. In general, it's a pleasure shooting with that camera. I think it's probably the best Leica rangefinder camera if you can live with black and white. If you need a color filter, go for the Leica M10R. That's another new camera, and I think in general these Leica rangefinders are beautiful. They deliver excellent image quality and I love shooting with them. But this video is about a comparison. And what I want to do is I want to compare the new Leica M10 Monochrom with the classical Leica M Monochrom. It's, to be precise, the Type 246. And this one here is a special edition. It's the so-called signature edition from Andy Summers, and it's limited to worldwide 50 units. So this is number 34 out of 50 units worldwide. It's a beauty of a camera, and it is the classical M Mono. Let's put them side by side, let's compare the image quality, and let's kick off the video. Before we look into image quality, let's have a look at design and functionality of these two beautiful cameras here. And if we start with the M10 Monochrom, it's a minimalistic design, which is of course inherited from the M10 and the M10P. So you have only 3 buttons on the left-hand side of the LCD, whereas on the classical M Mono, you have 6 buttons on the left-hand side of the LCD. And I come back to these buttons later and their functionality, of course. You have one control button here with 4 directions and a push in the middle. You have a control wheel here. I use this control wheel for many things. For instance, you can use it for zooming into the scene and check focus. You can use it for controlling your exposure. There are various things you can do here. You have an on-off switch. That's again minimalistic. If we compare this with the classical M Mono, the on-off switch has several functions embedded into it. And that's also something nice. I come back to this later in the video. We have an exposure dial, we have an ISO dial. You can pull this up, then you can turn it, and let's put it to auto for a second. And then you can lock it, and then it's locked. And then there's one more button here, which is this one here. And that's important for long exposures. And you see this in videos I have on my channel, how to use it and how to exploit it for long exposure shootings. Newer Leica M series cameras do not have video functionality. What you have here, let's open this up for a second, let's switch it on. And what you have in the drive mode here is intervalometer. And that's nice, so you can program an intervalometer and can then later in post compose single frames into a time-lapse movie, but that's the only, let's say, movie functionality you basically get on the M10, the M10P, the M10R and the M10 Monochrom. And that was different on former M series rangefinder cameras, and I come to that in a moment. The last thing I want to point out is touch functionality. So here on these cameras you have touch functionality. Let's maybe close this up for a second, because then we see it. So for instance, I'm now on spot metering, and I can choose with a touch of my finger where light gets metered, and that is something which was not included on old M series rangefinder cameras. So let's get the Leica M10 Monochrom out of sight here, and let's have a look at the classical M Mono camera. Or maybe I get it back for a second, because if you compare the two, you see the leaner design on the M10 Monochrom. And in general, the M10, the M10P, there were also improvements on, you know, the noise of the shutter, and the M10R and the M10 Monochrom. This new design series, they are leaner, compacter, and their overall appearance is smaller. And I use very often a hand grip here, like I use it on the classical M Mono for a better grip. This one here is a beauty, of course, in particular because of its special design being the signature edition. But let's look at the design of the camera. I pointed out already that we have now 6 buttons here on the classical design on the left-hand side of the LCD. We also have a control button here with 4 directions and a push in the middle. We have the same control wheel which we saw on the M10 Monochrom, but the on-off switch is embedded with functionality, and that's actually something very nice. So you have single shooting, you have continuous shooting, and you have self-timer. And on the M10 Monochrome, you would have to find these elements like timer, for instance, or continuous and single shooting in the menu and then activate it in a, let's call it, software way, whereas here you have a mechanical element which you can use, and I still think this was a good idea. I don't know why Leica gave up on it, but probably it's part of the overall simplistic, minimalistic design they wanted for the M10, M10P, M10R and M10 Monochrom. What's missing on the classical M Monochrom and in general on the classical M rangefinder series cameras is the ISO dial. So there is no dial here, and on the M10 Monochrom you have that ISO dial I showed before. That was introduced with the Leica M10 and I think is very convenient, but you have something which compensates you for that dial. And that's here on the side. As I said, we have the double number of buttons here, and there is a dedicated ISO button. You can push and hold that, and then you can change your settings on ISO in a nice way. So there is in fact a mechanical element which you can use to operate ISO in the same way as if you would have an ISO dial here. And then the last thing to point out is the dedicated movie button here. It says M for movie. And if you push that button, it starts immediately the recording. And if we go into the settings and go to video recording, this is only going up to 1080p with 25 or 24 frames per second, but it's better than nothing. And it's a, let's say, HD black and white video with super high quality. So I think it's actually nice to have that feature. I have no idea why Leica removed the video capabilities from the newer M series rangefinders, so the M10, M10P, M10R and M10 Monochrom. My guess is it would not take a lot of effort to make these cameras video capable again, but they just decided to keep it out, and I think they have their reasons. On the Leica Q2, for instance, and of course on the Leica SL2, you have that video capability back. You can go up to 4K or cinematic 4K, but that's not included in rangefinder cameras. Here in the old classical series, you can at least go to 1080p, and I think that's nice. So what else should I say to these cameras if we put them again side by side? The exposure dial for shutter speed is the same, is also in the same place. The button for long exposures is here. That's the same on the M10 Monochrom as I mentioned before. And that's basically it. I think now is time to look into image quality. I will have these cameras side by side and will take 3 different exposure situations, compare the images and then conclude the video with some recommendations and advice for people who are interested in black and white photography. The sample images we are going to look at were taken in Ticino in Switzerland in the same location in, let's say, mid of August, where I made a comparison of the Leica M10R versus the Leica SL2, and I will post the link to that video down below in the info box. Let's start with capture 1. Let's have a look at the images now. So here's my sample image. This is across the Lake of Lugano, and people who watched my video on the M10R versus the SL2 know that image. Just that this time it comes in black and white. And on the left hand side you have the M10 Mono, so the new mono camera, and on the right hand side you have the classical M Mono camera. And you see the exposure is taken kind of correct here. I named this here 0 stops, and it's the digital negative, of course. We have an ISO of 160. Let's quickly go into the metadata here. ISO of 160, fast shutter speed, so 1/1000 seconds. Aperture was set at f5.6. The aperture is not carried from the lens into the body, but I know that f5.6 was my choice because for many lenses that's the sweet spot. And I was shooting here with the Summilux M 50mm widest open aperture f2. The same, of course, on the classical M Mono in order to have comparability. And on the classical M Mono, I had to go to a faster shutter speed. Let's go back here on this side here. You see again Summilux M 50mm, and you see here Leica M Monochrom type 246. That's all as pre-announced in the video. And then we have an ISO of 320, so we could not go down to an ISO of 160 because the Leica M10 Monochrom can only go down to 160. The old classical M Monochrom can only go to ISO 320, and that's the minimum ISO value you can choose. That means I had to go faster to 1/1500. The aperture is the same, so again we have full comparability here, although the images look slightly different, but that's probably not due to exposure. So summarizing our situation now, what I wanted to do is I wanted to go down to the lowest native ISO I can have on these cameras, because that clearly is an advantage on the M10 Mono, that you can go down to an ISO of 160 and do not get stuck at 320 as on the classical M Mono. What this means in terms of image quality, we'll look into that in a moment. So the situation then also triggered, of course, that I had to go faster on the shutter speed on the classical M Mono than I was on the M10 Mono. Let's now have a deeper look at these two images, and again M10M left hand side, classical M Mono on the right hand side. So if we go here, let's go up to 200%. And first of all, what you see here, let's scroll a little bit. The next layer of the mountains in the background is super foggy. It was a hazy day, so I had to live with the weather conditions. Nothing I could do about that. Let's scroll down here and let's focus on this part of the image for a moment. And let's get these two buildings side by side, in particular the writing on the wall. And there is the first thing I want to clearly point out here. So if I now go up to the maximum zoom I can get on the Capture One zoom function here, you see first of all that the left hand side on the M10 Mono is larger in the image section, and that's because of the higher resolution. We have here on the left hand side 40 megapixels and on the right hand side we have 24 megapixels. So in order to correct for this, I go on the left hand side to 300%, and on the right hand side on the classical M Mono I stay at 400%. And now if you look into that writing on the wall here of that building, you see clearly the advantage of the higher resolution. But having said that, we are already at 300 respectively 400% zoom here, so this enables clearly very large prints on both cameras. But the resolution advantage is with the M10 Mono, because here you have still, let's call it a clear writing. On the right hand side you see artifacts and pixels, which is something which is natural if you go for a 24 megapixel resolution to a 400% crop. If we try to adjust for the image section now, so we see the same part of the image in both images, again left hand side 300% crop, right hand side 400%, and we move down a little bit, I think this is absolutely amazing. And the amazing fact you see here is how well the classical M Mono is keeping pace with the M10 Monochrom. So from a pure resolution perspective, let's scroll down a little bit here, maybe again into the trees here. And it's absolutely eye-catching how the classical Leica M Monochrom is resolution-wise basically a match for the newly developed M10 Monochrom in the way we see it here. Fantastic image quality, super high details and sharpness in that image. So I think I like a lot what I'm seeing here. Let's go back to the full view on the images. I think, and that's the first conclusion, from a pure resolution perspective, there is not an urgent need to upgrade from a classical M Mono camera Type 246 to an M10 Monochrom, because what we've seen is, even if we deeply zoom in, if we take deep crops in the image, the clarity, structure and detail on the 24 megapixel monochrome sensor is still almost a match for the M10 Monochrom sensor. And clearly, if you don't have a classical M Monochrom and you're considering to purchase one, then it's not a question, of course, to go for the M10 Monochrom, because here you have 40 megapixels, you can go even deeper if you need, you can do larger prints, and clearly you get this tiny little extra quantum of quality and a more modern sensor, of course, and we come to a few other aspects in a moment, than what you have on the classical M. But in general, a good result. The veteran M Monochrom is still good enough and almost a match for the M10 Monochrom. So I want to shortly look into two more examples here, and one will be an overexposure situation and the other one will be an underexposure situation. I did this before with cameras. It's not scientific, so on the left hand side the M10 Mono again, on the right hand side the M Mono, and both cameras have been overexposed by give or take 2 stops. And I leave the work now to Capture One to adjust this. So I go to auto adjust and let's see what I get back, and then I think I should look into the images and crop in a little bit. I think this is still remarkably good on both cameras. Look at the details you get, the clarity. You could probably on both images go down a little bit more with exposure. They are still pretty bright, but it's nice how the camera is recovering out of the highlights, structure and details. This looks really good on both images. and I don't see a remarkable difference here if I go through that. That is still very much convincing what we see here. It's actually interesting. I think the mountain on the classical M Mono even comes out of the highlights a little better than on the M10 Mono, but this can also be due to a slight change of weather conditions. As I said, the weather was hazy and somehow changing permanently, and you see that foggy situation here. If I stay on the, let's say, M10 Mono for a moment and go down a little more on exposure, or maybe on the highlights, no, you don't get it out in the same way as you see it on the classical M Mono. So I think here the recovery out of highlights is even better. That's interesting. Anyway, we probably have to repeat this with less stressful weather conditions and have another look into this. But in general, on both cameras, a very good result. Also here, if we look at the tree structure, and we are looking into recovery out of shadows in a moment, but if we boost the shadows up here, we can get a lot more information out of the shadows. So both sensors very likely have a very high dynamic range, which is something confirming results I had before when I presented on my channel shootings with the M10 Mono. And here's the last experiment I did. So I underexposed by give or take 2 stops. On the classical M Mono, this was the end of story. I was at an ISO of 320, lower values are not possible, and I was shooting at 1/4000 seconds, so I could have stopped down more. Instead of going for f5.6, I could have gone to an f8 or something like that, but I wanted to keep the aperture, since it's the same lens, the Summilux 50mm at the same value, so I have to live with what I got out. It's not scientific anyway what I'm doing here, and again I leave the work to capture one and do an auto adjust, and then we get the images in, let's say, a correct exposure, automatically adjusted. And also here it looks very good. Let's just quickly look into the image, and there is absolutely no difference here. Now also on the mountains it looks exactly the same. If you look into the structure here, clarity, detail, everything recovered out of shadows. And again, strong confirmation of high dynamic range on both sensors, the classical M Mono as well as the M10 Monochrom, as I've shown before on my channel. So quickly concluding, I found the following. The sensors of the M10 Mono and the M Mono, they are both excellent, and the M10 Mono has the advantage of the higher resolution, of course, but the M Mono with its 24 megapixels is still good enough for 2020 and beyond, and there is no urgent need to upgrade if you own a camera like this. The second is on dynamic range. Both sensors are excellent and deliver from all angles. And the third is you have more mechanical elements on the classical M Mono, and in addition you get 1080p video in black and white, which is nice, of course. On the flip side of the coin, the M10 Mono has a newly developed sensor with a black and white design and a super high resolution in a more compact body than the former M Monochrom from Leica. If you liked that video, I'm happy if you drop me your thumbs up, and please don't forget to subscribe to my channel. Thanks for watching and peace out.